Welcome to the Chapter 22 overview, The Rise and Fall of World Communism, 1917 to the Present. During the 20th century, communist governments were established around the world, having a significant impact on international relations before they generally collapsed at the end of the century. I get a lot of questions from students about why the United States is so involved in issues all over the world. Our country is often referred to as the policeman of the world, a role for us that began in response to the events described in this chapter. Our country emerged from the Cold War as the most powerful country in the world with a superpower role. In this map, you can see foreign aid in 2010 from the United States to countries around the world, and the darker the color, the more money we are donating to that place. Most current events in the world today are shaped by this relationship, and it's critical for us to understand how we got to this position so that we can evaluate our role in international affairs going forward. Setting the stage. You'll remember from earlier studies that Karl Marx created communism as a response to the problems of the Industrial Revolution. In many places, the industrialized world created a huge divide between rich and poor. As you know, the first communist revolution was in Russia in 1917. This chapter reviews the communist revolutions in Russia and China, so it's helpful to remember background about each place, especially Russia's industrial progress as of 1917 and the Chinese emphasis on Confucian values and obeying group norms. Both are significant in this chapter. So the first heading is called Global Communism. Following the Russian Revolution, communism spread around the world, creating various types of alliances. As this map shows, in the decades after World War II, a series of revolutions swept across Eurasia, most notably in China, Korea, Vietnam, and also in Cuba. In this map, the pink color is communist governments, the blue color is democratic governments, and the green color is governments that had not really chosen a side, and this is the three-world order during the Cold War, and you'll learn more about that later in the chapter. In addition to revolutions that successfully overthrew established governments, there were also smaller movements in Africa and Latin America. In general, communist agitation was seen as a legitimate response, for some people, to the problems of the Industrial Revolution and to European colonialism. Comparing revolutions as a path to communism. The Russian and Chinese revolutions had similar goals, but tried to achieve them in significantly different ways. First, remember that Russia had a revolution in 1905 that altered the absolute authority of the monarchy and replaced it with the representative government that shared power with the Tsar. Russian citizens experienced intense frustration with World War I and the economic issues that resulted. Vladimir Lenin led these protests, and his Bolshevik party proposed a communist solution to Russia's woes that ended in a seizure of power in 1917. A civil war followed, from which the Bolsheviks emerged victorious, renaming the country the Soviet Union. Lenin died a few years later, and his successor, Joseph Stalin, expanded political control over his own country and, after World War II, over Eastern Europe. Shown on this map, USSR is the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also called the Soviet Union, and you can see in red here are communist governments, and so this section here is the part of Eastern Europe controlled by communist governments after the war, and we'll get to that later as well. China's last dynasty, the Qing, fell in 1911, and by the 1920s, China was ruled by a nationalist party which pursued mainly Western-style modernization programs. Mao Zedong was the leader of the Communist Party, which fought a 30-year civil war against Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalist Party. Mao is shown here riding the horse. Mao and his communists won in 1949, appealing largely to the rural peasant class. This is a significant difference compared to the Russian Revolution, which mainly appealed to urban industrial workers. Mao's success came mainly from addressing social issues and by appealing to Chinese nationalism by fighting against the Japanese invasion in World War II, shown on the map here. During the war, Japan controlled all of this orange part, and down here in red are the bases from which Mao operated in the years before 1934, and they helped to fight back against the Japanese invasion, earning the support of many Chinese peasants. Building socialism in two countries. In the Soviet Union and China, government leaders used totalitarian methods of control to create societies consistent with socialist philosophy. First, feminism. In both China and the Soviet Union, communist governments enacted policies of state-directed feminism, which had some economic success. However, there was not a significant change in gender roles, socially or politically. In general, feminism was seen as consistent with the general philosophy of communism. Another common feature of communism in both countries was the notion of redistributing land so everyone is equal. This Marxist policy was carried out in both the Soviet Union and China, though more forcibly in the Soviet Union. In both cases, the process of collectivizing agriculture proved disastrous. Over 5 million died in the Soviet Union and over 20 million in China due to these policies. Unwilling to admit mistakes or weakness, in both the Soviet Union and China, the government used propaganda to enforce support of collectivization. Now, industrial development. At the inception of the revolutions, both the Soviet Union and China were considerably behind their capitalist rivals in industrial development. Both countries pursued state-directed industrialization in an effort to modernize and compete with other nations. In this picture, you can see China using manpower as opposed to heavy machinery to construct a dam. This program of state-directed industrialization was more welcome in the Soviet Union than in China, where a pre-revolutionary mistrust of industrialists carried over. These were manifested in the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution. These efforts to combat westernization and capitalization had a drastic impact on Chinese society, and look for that impact as you read. Finally, the search for enemies. Both of these countries were totalitarian in nature, meaning that their governments did not tolerate dissent, regularly persecuting political enemies. In the Soviet Union, Stalin began the Great Purges in the 1930s. 5 to 6 million people were killed or imprisoned. Here are 4 photos. This is Stalin with the mustache right here. And this is a good example of the purges because you can see in each of these photos somebody is disappearing. And that's because they were labeled as enemies of the state, and Stalin didn't want pictures of him next to enemies of the state, so they were actually airbrushed right out of the picture. In China, Mao began the Cultural Revolution to re-educate citizens who had drifted from communism. Both of these movements demonstrate the strong and almost complete power of these governments. In fact, a feature of communist governments across the world has been an unwavering attachment to Marxist principles and a heavy-handed enforcement of unpopular policies. Now we turn to the Cold War. Following World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union began a period of political and economic hostility known as the Cold War. When communism expanded into Eastern Europe after World War II, the continent became divided in half. There was a metaphor used by Winston Churchill called the Iron Curtain, which was an imaginary line along this boundary here between, in green, the communist totalitarian governments, and in purple, the democratic capitalist governments. In Asia, the U.S. gave economic and military aid and sometimes sent troops to stop the spread of communism, especially in Korea and Vietnam. This policy of containment was a defining feature of the Cold War. Other key hotspots were Afghanistan and Cuba. So on this map here is Korea, and the United States fought a conflict that we call the Korean War to stop the spread of communism, and that resulted in the 2 countries we have today, North and South Korea. Down here we have Vietnam, also a war we fought. In Afghanistan, the United States helped fight against the spread of communism into Afghanistan in the 70s. And there was a conflict in Egypt, and also here in Cuba, which has been a communist country for some time now. Following America's use of atomic bombs during World War II, the Soviets developed them as well. An arms race ensued, with each nation possessing thousands of these destructive weapons. A policy known as mutually assured destruction ensured that the Cold War remained cold due to the threat of nuclear war. To illustrate this, here's a quote from Albert Einstein. He said, "I don't know what weapons World War III will be fought with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." Despite the lack of direct conflict, Americans and Soviets tried in various ways to influence events in third world countries, and this contributed to the period of tension that we call the Cold War. The U.S. emerged from World War II with the world's strongest economy and began to export manufactured goods around the world. This industrial might also enabled America to establish a worldwide military presence, largely in efforts to halt the spread of communism. The military played such a crucial role in American politics and foreign policy that President Eisenhower warned of a military-industrial complex that threatened basic freedoms. Beginning in the 1950s, American culture was also influential around the world, a process that continues to this day. To illustrate this, as of 2015, the #1 worldwide movie of all time, in terms of sales, is Avatar, followed by the Titanic, and then the Avengers. The communist world. Many Westerners perceive global communism as a united bloc, but there were many internal disagreements during the Cold War. After Stalin's death in 1953, Soviet leaders backed away from some of his more extreme policies, which accidentally encouraged anti-Soviet protests in Eastern Europe, such as this one in Czechoslovakia in 1968, and also contributed to a growing conflict between China and the USSR. These weaknesses contributed to the fall of communism by the end of the century, which is covered in more detail in the next section. Economic and moral failures led to the fall of communism in the Soviet Union and China and the end of the Cold War. First, China. Mao died in 1976, and his successor, Deng Xiaoping, initiated economic reforms that were essentially capitalist in nature, encouraging the growth of entrepreneurship and accepting personal profit. Since then, China's policy has been to allow economic freedom while maintaining totalitarian political control. This famous picture shows the government's reaction to pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square in 1989. More recently, China has rejected calls for democratic elections in Hong Kong. The fall of communism was more complete in the Soviet Union, resulting in the collapse of the communist government. In the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary, initiating economic and political reforms. What he intended as an openness to new ideas got out of his control, spreading to Eastern Europe. Popular protests across the Soviet Empire resulted in the collapse of communism in Europe and the Soviet Union, effectively ending the communist era there. On this map of Europe, everything in green used to be the Soviet Union, and Russia is now reduced to this boundary here. And there are a number of new countries that escaped Soviet control after the fall of the Soviet Union, such as Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. And then in orange over here, we have the former states that were controlled by the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe during the Cold War, which also became independent. Now for the 10-second spice review. Communist revolutions changed roles of women while leading to the decades-long conflict between communist and capitalist countries known as the Cold War. The threat of nuclear war controlled international relations, even as communism was presented as a solution to global problems. At the end of the century, communist governments turned away from economic control in favor of free market reforms. And finally, the visual summary. We start with communist revolutions in the Soviet Union and China. This caused communism to spread around the world to places like Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba, initiating an era called the Cold War. And after about a 50-year period, political and economic reforms in China and the Soviet Union led to the fall of communism and the end of the Cold War. That's your Chapter 22 overview. Happy reading!